The lore of hags has arrived to Warhammer 3. What does it do? What are the spells useful for? Let's have a look. First up, the Forbidden Fens. This is a speed reduction to an area, 25% reduction. Also hurts the enemy vigor, only costs 5 winds of magic, and Kislev pretty much already has this spell. In the lore of Ice, Ice Sheet does pretty much the exact same thing. So we'd use it in exactly the same way to slow enemy units down to buy more time for our missiles to fire. That's going to be the primary usage of it, I think. Although you could also use it to stop enemy units getting away as quickly if you really want to try and kill a unit off. This spell could maybe actually be most useful used alongside Ice Sheet. If you've got Katerin, say, and a Hag Witch, you can use both of those spells to put a 50% reduction to speed on affected units, and then give you loads of time to blast them. So it's a useful spell overall, but Kislev does already kind of have it. Now the interesting thing about this lorebook is that all the spells have an overcast, but they're kind of a positive and a negative. So we just looked at the negative for the Forbidden Fens. If you overcast it, you'll now get the positive, which you can use as a buff to your faction, rather than a debuff to the enemy faction. So with this one, it's still affecting the speed, but it's giving plus 25% speed to your faction, and gives some vigor back, makes the unit unspottable. But honestly, I'm not really sure what this spell is supposed to be used for. It's kind of contradictory, because you have to put down the zone and it stays in the zone, it doesn't follow the unit. So if you put that down, they become unspottable, which is great, but then they have to stay in there to stay unspottable, which means they can't use the speed boost, so it kind of feels a bit useless. If it followed the unit, it would be great because you could have them unspottable and give them the extra speed so they could flank easier. That would be useful, but honestly, I can't really recommend a great way to use this spell because it just seems a bit weird. The Vigor replenishment is nice. Maybe if you put your entire army in that area and then Vigor replenish them, that would be useful. But otherwise, I'd say just stick to the non-overcast version that debuffs the enemy and slows their speed, rather than wasting it on buffing your unit's speed in a tiny small area. And then we have the Witch Brew spell. This is a breath attack, costs 6 winds of magic. Going to be similar to any other breath spell. This one has no armor piercing damage at all though, so use it on lighter targets, 30 armor or less preferably. And it does come with the poison effect, which can actually make this spell a lot more useful, because poison reduces speed by 15%. So if we combine that with the previous spell, the Forbidden Fens, you can see it's there. I'm now going to drop this spell, and it's going to reduce the enemy speed by 40% from those two combined effects. So that's going to be one of the most useful ways to use it, because missiles are one of the strongest parts of Kislev's army. So any speed reduction allowing us to do a good bit of damage before the enemy arrives to us is always going to be helpful. But of course, you can just use it as a normal damage spell. It'll do decent damage to those lightly armored targets. And obviously the debuff to the enemy's damage from poison are also useful. So yeah, a handy little damage and debuff spell. So that was the negative. Now to the positive, buffing up your faction. The overcast version of Witch Brew becomes Witch Broth for 8 winds of magic. It's still a breath attack, but doesn't do damage now, and instead heals your troops. Also restores their vigor and makes them immune to contact effects like fire and magic. So obviously use it as a heal, but it does only restore 0.6% health per second, and it only lasts 7 seconds. So overall, it'll restore about 4% of a unit's health, which obviously isn't very much. So using it on a single unit isn't really that useful. You want to try and hit as many units as possible, because there's no cap. You can hit 10 units or even your whole army 20 units if you want. But realistically, hitting 3, 4, 5 units with it is going to be good. You're going to give 4% health back to all of those units, and that can make this spell pretty useful. Next we have Curse of the Ancient Witch. Costs 8 winds of magic. This is a hex. Will reduce an enemy unit's armor by 60 and their missile block chance by 48, potentially spreading to up to 5 other units. Lasts a pretty nice 27 seconds. This spell is pretty much designed for taking down these kind of big boys with heavy armor and big silver shields. However, the whole spreading to other units thing doesn't really work that well. As you can see here, there's a bunch of units shoulder to shoulder. I put it on the central unit, and it doesn't even spread to the units either side of it, only the Lord behind it, which kind of makes the spell a little bit inconsistent and a bit of a gamble to use, because, well, if it spreads to all 3 units, that would be great and would be really useful for us blasting away at these strong units. But if it only lands on 1 unit and doesn't spread somehow in 27 seconds, then it's kind of not that great. It only costs 8 winds of magic, so it's not a huge loss. And if it's a strong unit that you're taking down, like some Chosen or something, then it's probably worth the 8 winds of magic. But if you can get it to chain to 5 units, then it is going to be good bang for your buck. Because obviously when you spread it to another unit, it'll reset the timer for them, so it'll be 27 seconds on them, and then they'll spread it to someone else, and they'll get 27 seconds on them. But it still feels like the aura should maybe be like 35, 40 meters, so it could potentially spread it to a bunch of units shoulder to shoulder. For the overcast version of this spell, it now buffs your ranged troops. Their damage and reload speed also gives magical attacks. Same cost in Winds of Magic, lasts 24 seconds, and comes with the same issue as the previous version of the spell. Can be nicely teamed up with the Forbidden Fence spell again that reduces the enemy's speed, but as you see, I put it on this unit of Streltsy, and it doesn't even spread to the unit of Kossars right next to them. So yeah, feels like you're getting gypped a little bit, it feels like a bit of a con. I found that if I ran the Kossars over to the Streltsy, they would actually catch it then. You see it there, go on. So they now have gained the buff, but now they have to run back to position so they can actually cleanly fire. So it's kind of silly that you have to micro in that way to actually be able to gain the buff. I did try setting up in some different formations to make it work, and going like this does work, but this is a ridiculously dangerous formation. If artillery or other missiles started shooting at you, they're going to have a field day with this little formation, but it does work in making all units gain the buff. All 4 of these units are now juiced up, so it is some big power coming from that extra damage. But I think an extra 5 or 10 meters on the spread range would really make it much more useful. Otherwise, this spell of giving extra missile damage is great for taking down large single entities or something with a physical resistance because of the magical attacks. But a good spell, it just needs to be fiddled around with to make the most of it. Much like your peen. Alright, next spell, Vengeance of Spirits. This is a direct damage area spell that also causes silence. Silence stops anything from using their abilities or spells. Costs 12 Winds of Magic, lasts 11 seconds. For the most part, this is just a handy direct damage spell like any other. Does some good damage and doesn't have a target limit, so the more enemy units you can fit inside this circle, the more you're going to be able to damage, meaning it has some pretty unlimited potential. As for the silence that comes with it, taking away units' abilities and spells, it'll stop things like this Revel in Slaughter ability for the Lord here, which will give melee attack and leadership. These Bloodletters won't benefit from that, but it only lasts 11 seconds, which isn't really that much time to stop anything. It might stop a unit from casting a spell for 11 seconds, but I mean, what's 11 seconds? That's nothing. As soon as it runs out, it's just going to use those things anyway. As this Lord is going to do here, it just pops all its abilities. It's now got Locus of Wrath going off, which gives 40 melee attack to all nearby units. So we haven't really stopped anything with this silence. Mostly good for the damage, this spell. And then we have the Overcast version giving a positive to you. It still does direct damage, but to you and your units, so it will cause damage to self. Increases spell mastery by 40% though, and gives power recharge of 60%. Still costs same Winds of Magic, 19-second duration. This is a bit of a weird one because it can buff up things pretty well, but as you see here, if I use it in this area and I hit a bunch of units that can't cast spells, namely my armored Kossars, they're going to take the direct damage, but obviously they're not going to benefit from spell mastery, but I don't know whether they're helping recharge the magic, whether their sacrifice of health from the direct damage is actually giving us more recharge, or whether only spellcasters can do that. I'm not sure, so you want to be a little bit careful with this spell. If you get too many of your own units, you're going to be damaging a lot of units. Might be better just to put your spellcaster out the way and use it solely on them. But otherwise, 40% spell mastery is very powerful and can make spells much more potent. I'm sure there's some pretty nasty combinations with all of Kislev's available magic laws, but yeah, be careful not to kill half your army in the process with this one. And then we've got Malediction of Madness, a debuff for the enemy's damage by 50%, both types of damage, minus 24 melee attack, and gives Rampage. 16 Winds of Magic though, which is very expensive, and it only lasts 15 seconds. That, my friends, is what we call daylight robbery. I'll come straight out and say don't use this spell because 16 Winds of Magic for 15 seconds of this is not worth it. Reducing the enemy's damage output is always a handy thing to do, and it's a pretty significant debuff as well. The Rampage doesn't really affect anything, so that's kind of a non-factor. But the reason this sucks so hard is because of the Overcast version of the spell, which does basically the same thing but buffs up your unit. So extra 50% damage, extra melee attack, Rampage, again non-factor really. Costs 16 Winds of Magic again, still expensive, but lasts 43 seconds. That's the kind of duration I would expect, paying 16 goddamn magic. Now I'm going to go ahead and assume that maybe it's a mistake and that the other version of the spell is also supposed to be like 40 seconds long instead of 15, or maybe it's supposed to be cheaper in magic cost, but either way, I wouldn't use the debuffing version, only use the Overcast buffing version because you're just getting much more for the cost of magic. And you'll see these Kossars absolutely tear through these Bloodletters here, although they got shot up before they arrived. But overall, this version is a pretty strong spell to have a big damage boost for that long. If you put it on a strong damage dealer unit, they could get pretty nasty. And then we have the final spell, Cursed Cauldron. This is a bombardment spell. Some armor-piercing damage in this, costs 18 Winds of Magic, so quite expensive, lasts 22 seconds. Of course, with this, you want to try and find the biggest group of enemy troops you can and just dump it on their heads, fill up that circle as much as you can. It's only small, but it is quite powerful. You've got some explosions in there, you've got the little vortexes that come flying out of it. So there is some good damage to be done with this spell, of course, primarily against infantry. It's not going to do a great deal to things like monstrous infantry, or I guess maybe cavalry if they're tightly packed. But obviously things like choke point situations is where this kind of spell is really going to shine. On this normal version there is friendly fire, so you do have to be careful of taking out your own troops in the process. But with the area being quite small, that's not too big of a deal. If you do want to put it in some riskier spots to your own boys though, you can get the overcast version for an extra 4 winds of magic, which will stop the spell from hurting friendly units. This is going to be worth it if there's a particularly dangerous unit coming to get you that you want to try and put some damage on, but it's going to be on the front line and you don't want to hurt your own units. This might be useful to spend the extra magic on, but if you can't fill up most of that circle with enemy infantry, it's probably not going to be worth spending 22 winds of magic on. You might be better off with the direct damage spell or the breath spell, but a nice spell if you can find the right place to use it. So that's the Lore of Hags. It's got some decent spells in there for sure, but a bit of a flawed lore book, I would say. We'll see if it gets any changes over time. If you've got any ideas on ways you could use these spells, let me know below. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all the patrons who support this channel. If you want more of this stuff, I got them right here. Or if you want to see the Greenskins absolutely ravage the old world mod, I got that too. I'll see you in the future.